Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And today we are pleased to be joined by David Skinner, who has written a book now in paperback. The title of the book is The Story of Ain't. Yeah, you heard that right, The Story of Ain't. The subtitle, America, Its Language, and the Most Controversial Dictionary Ever Published. And it is now a Harper Perennial paperback. Thanks for joining us, David.
Thanks for having me on.
One of the things that I need to share with the audience is a little bit about your background, since this is a somewhat technical book, I suppose you could call it. You're a writer and editor living on the East Coast, and the things you write about include language, culture, and your own life. And you've been a staff editor at the Weekly Standard, and you're now an editor of Double Think magazine, and you're also currently the editor of Humanities magazine, and which is a publication of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And you've written for the Wall Street Journal, the New Atlantis, Slate, the Washington Times, and all those other good places. So you're quite a writer, and we're very happy to have you talk about this extremely interesting subject. At least you've made it very interesting, I think.
Well, thanks for saying that. I must correct you. I'm no longer the editor of Doublethink, but I am the editor, very proudly, of Humanities magazine, as you said.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry you got fired and all like that.
It was rough, but I'm working it out. My therapist says I'm making great progress.
The story of Ain't is, it seems to me, somewhat at the center of the story of usage. Where does it come from? Where does usage come from? What's acceptable, etc.? Would you kind of agree with that, or am I way off base?
The controversy that the book describes is certainly at the center of usage. The word "ain't," I wasn't sure what you were referring to, the title or the actual word. The actual word is a pretty old word, but it's always been considered a sort of low, dirty word.
Mm-hmm. Lowbrow.
It's never lowbrow. Highbrows may use it from time to time, always with a kind of knowing wink to their usage. But
I'm about to speak down to you guys. That kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, there's something playful about it, but you can find it and I've been collecting examples of "ain't" in contemporary sources, and I found it in the New York Times Book Review this weekend in a review by Margaret Atwood, who's certainly a very sophisticated writer.
Absolutely.
I found it in the New Yorker.
Uh-huh.
I found it in many publications from many very good writers. We use it emphatically now. We use it to really push a point. It's like I'm going to get down and dirty and really honest with you right now. I'm going to be very frank with you.
Gotcha.
That's when we use "ain't."
Now, the story of Ain't, the book, is somewhat the story of Webster's third new international dictionary, which was published in 1961. And as the press release says, it added thousands of new words, while radically breaking with tradition to describe how the language was actually used. And in that sense was in open defiance of what I was learning in class at that time, that classroom grammar and artificial notions of correctness were no longer to be observed. And that is radical, I think.
That was radical. Dictionaries had been really for a very long time a kind of tool for bookish people, and they drew on bookish culture for their knowledge of the language. In 1961, we really see a new dictionary that benefits from a broader view of language that is not simply limited to the kind of books that make it into the Harvard classics.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes from the scientific study of language as it is actually used in conversation, in spontaneous formations, and used by everyone who speaks it. And Webster's Third made a big deal about not being simply a dictionary that described the language as, say, Alexander Pope used it, or I don't know, John Stuart Mill, or just one of these great names of the tradition, but it wanted to describe the language as ordinary people used it, the language as you use it in a way.
Well,
not you in particular, but as we all use it.
Yeah. Well, this effort to look for meaning in how the language is used goes back, many years. I mean, we go back to the 1920s when a fellow that you cite, Charles Carpenter Freeze, said in part, "The real meaning of any word must be finally determined, not by its original meaning or source or etymology, but by the content given the word in actual present usage." Now, that was way back in the 1920s, and I guess maybe that's the start of it all?
That's the start of it all as I could work it into a book.
Uh-huh.
There are earlier antecedents, but for American linguistics, yes, this is a major starting point, the 1920s with Charles Carpenter Freeze. And if you look at the controversy over a word like literally, you could see what was so radical about what he was saying. Some people complain that literally is misused to mean figuratively. And he was saying, no, if literally is being used the same way that everyone uses a word like very, then that's what it is. It's just a generic intensifier. It no longer literally means literally.
Well, the story of ain't shows that the battle of usage is never ending. When we return, the battle goes on.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
The story of ain't. Yes, you heard that right. The story of ain't. America, its language, and the most controversial dictionary ever published. That's our book today. And the author, David Skinner, has been nice enough to join us. His publisher is Harper Perennial. And Simon Winchester, who, as you will recall, is a best-selling author, written books like The Professor and the Madman and Atlantic. He says, in part, it takes true brilliance to lift the arid tellings of lexicographic fussing into the readable realm of the thriller and the bodice ripper. With his riveting account of the furious rows over publication in the 60s of Webster's third edition, David Skinner has done precisely this, taking a fine story and honing it to popular perfection. I like that. I think he's right. You've done that in large part. One of the other things you do quite well, at least in my opinion, is you find ways to define things in an interesting manner. For example, there's a gentleman by the name of, you quote, Clement Greenberg, and he used the term kitsch to describe, quote, a gigantic apparition of Hollywood movies and Tin Pan Alley music and Norman Rockwell covers on the Saturday Evening Post. Kitsch saved one from the hard work of looking at Picasso's. It predigested art. I love that, predigested art. And at another point, you quote a fellow. Let me see who it is. Oh, you get into a definition of standard English, which becomes a very important concept. Standard English was not standard because it was more correct or beautiful, but because it was the language used in the conduct for the important affairs of people. Has that now been pretty much accepted?
I don't think that's entirely accepted. I'm at that point in the book, I'm trying to explicate the views of linguists like Charles Carpenter Freeze and Leonard Bloomfield. And they're saying that what we take to be standard English is historically the kind of triumphant variety of English that was, current in the conduct of political affairs and sort of powerful people in Great Britain and the United States. I think that is I think some people today wonder why something like African American vernacular English isn't considered standard English, and this is in part the answer. Historically, that's not the variety of English that became the dominant variety. It's not that, and it's interesting to realize that linguists were looking at this so long ago and realizing that you could have a beautiful language, you could have a language that is, rational, full-bodied, and with excellent finish on the mouth, but still that's not the standard language. And what is the standard language is standard not because it's more beautiful, not because it's more logical, but it's because that's what the powerful people spoke. And this is certainly the standard view among linguists, but other people take a very different view of things. I think most people say that the reason the standard language is the standard language is because it bested all the other varieties in terms of beauty. There was a popularity contest somewhere in our history, and obviously this is the one that won. But that's not what the linguists are saying.
Okay. There's a story in here about our friend Charles Fries. He writes a book called American English Grammar, which used a survey, actually, of uneducated people to find out what their grammar was like. And what happened was he gathered all this stuff together and sent it to his publisher, and he wanted both kinds of grammar published in his book. And he sent forward hundreds of passages of so-called uneducated grammar. And the proofreader, the copy editor at the publishing house, eliminated every one of them.
It's hilarious.
Well, it's hilarious. It's how wrong being right can be.
Yeah, your first critic is your proofreader, and he's just undone all your work. Months and months of work. That was it's a fascinating study of how conversational English and how the languages many people use it is different from not only standard English, but from sort of English teacher blessed English, the kind that's preferred in the classroom. And he painstakingly recorded all these examples of uneducated grammar, and it's a fascinating study, but it is also very ironic that his proofreader basically rewrote all these examples. It's as if you went through a whole list of medical samples and made them healthy before the researcher was allowed to talk about them or publish on them.
Well, the happy kicker to that story is that he had another copy of the manuscript, and they could move forward with the publication. Otherwise, I think somebody would have been murdered if that wasn't the case.
Yes, I learned that story from his son. It still brings a smile to the members of that family.
Oh, it should. It should. The other thing that comes up, over and over in the book is this notion of what language or what English is standard. And we'll look a little bit more at that when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
We are talking about the story of Ain't, America, its language, and the most controversial dictionary ever published. And it's written by David Skinner, who's been good enough to spend some time with us today. And I think it's time to go right to the nub of the story. That is the publication of the most controversial dictionary ever published. And if you read from the opening of chapter 32, everybody will know why it was the most controversial. Could you do that for us, please?
Oh, sure. Are you ready? Okay. In addition to a lively cast of characters, Betty Grable, Mickey Spillane, Polly Adler, Dwight D. Eisenhower. The story of the making of Webster's Third came with enough impressive-sounding gee-whiz facts and figures to be picked up by many a local and national newspaper. The dictionary weighed 13.5 pounds and featured 100,000 new words and senses, a massive amount of new language that Merriam called the greatest vocabulary explosion in history. While new words were being added, 250,000 entries were subtracted, and all remaining entries were revised. Every line of it's new, Gove wrote in the preface. With 450,000 total entries, the new dictionary contained 100,000 quotations from more than 14,000 authors. The foundation for Merriam-Webster's lexicography comprised some 10 million citations, and the new edition had cost $3.5 million to make. The press release, which had been read and approved by President Gordon J. Gallen, so abbreviated the dictionary's entry for ain't that it amounted to a misquotation. From the usage note written into the first sense, used orally in most parts of the U.S. by many cultivated speakers, it left out that ain't was disapproved by many and more common in less educated speech. And the press release failed to show that a substandard label was attached to the second sense. Compounding these errors, the release said that ain't gets official recognition at last. So not only was ain't being defended, perhaps even recommended for the oral use of cultivated speakers, the press release also suggested that this was the first time ain't was recognized by a dictionary. But none of this was true.
Well, it seems to me that that's more than shooting yourself in the foot. That's absolutely amazing. You know, and the problems of coming up with the dictionary in the first place were monumental. They were thinking of making it at least a 2-volume kind of thing, and turned that down. So then, what they talk about had to happen. Things had to be eliminated, which wasn't easy. And after all that hard work and so forth, they start getting a rather negative reaction to the dictionary. What was
exactly
going on? I mean, who was in your opinion the biggest naysayer among the critics?
The very biggest. Well, it's a close call. The New York Times called on Merriam-Webster to take the dictionary back and start over, and that's really a seminal moment in this controversy. You know, imagine a book review that says,
"Yeah,
David Skinner, collect all the copies of your book out there,
yeah.
Put them away, put them in the garbage, forget all the effort and blood, sweat, and tears you poured into this project. Start over." So the New York Times deserves a very special place in this story.
I think so.
But probably the biggest naysayer, or the most famous one, certainly till now, is Dwight MacDonald.
Ah, yes.
The great mid-century essayist, one-time socialist, Cold Warrior, a fascinating guy, and a very, very gifted reporter and writer. He wrote a long essay about Webster's Third in the New Yorker in the spring of 1962. And it's a really remarkable piece of work. It does a very great job in some ways of describing various aspects of making the dictionary. He criticizes several things that he doesn't like, but then at the end of the piece, he comes down like a ton of bricks on this dictionary. he goes into this sort of song about how if we don't watch each other's usage, you know, everything that makes up our civilization is going to start to slip away from us. And he quotes at length this speech from Troilus and Cressida, and it's a remarkable speech because it's a speech in which the character describes the waters rising on Earth and civilizations being wiped out and man being turned into like a savage wolf, as he attacks other men, and gone goodbye government, goodbye laws, goodbye norms of behavior. We're all like, starving dogs, fighting over last bit of steak in a cage. It's an apocalyptic vision of the world that comes into being because we're not minding our P's and Q's over language.
Yes, and it announced, in short, the very end of civilization itself.
Which is a little bit crazy.
Yeah, quite a little bit. Quite a little bit. Were there any defenders?
There were some defenders. There were in various places. The defenders were never quite as loud, or in some cases even as eloquent as the denouncers. But Time magazine, which is a very popular magazine then, obviously, defended the dictionary, and the Wall Street Journal also defended the dictionary. But the real defense of the dictionary came from the academic establishment. A man named James Sled, who was a really big deal in his time and still pretty influential in the field of linguistics and language study. He made a really vigorous defense of the dictionary against Dwight MacDonald. He was so furious when he read Dwight MacDonald's essay in the New Yorker. He couldn't believe that the New Yorker would allow such a chump, such an ignoramus to be the last word on this dictionary. He thought it was a travesty. He ran into colleagues of his at various colleges around Chicago.
Yeah.
Who said to him that they had read the Dwight MacDonald piece, and so they were never going to look at the dictionary. They knew what it was about. And he was so furious about this. Just the power the press has to tell a story and to just silence all the people who would defend this dictionary and who would speak up for the good work that went into it. Not that it was a perfect dictionary. He didn't think it was a perfect dictionary, but he was furious about its serial denunciation.
Well, we can go on talking about this controversy in the story for a long, long time. Certainly the dictionary has had a good life despite early denunciation. And the story of Ain't, America, Its Language, and the Most Controversial Dictionary Ever Published, is a way to enter the fray in a very enjoyable manner. We've been talking to the author of that book, David Skinner, and this is Conversations on the Coast.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.